Nicole, I'll let you just say hi to everybody and then we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be able to speak with you and talk about not only my work, but all the amazing work in this show. So it's going to be really great.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just like to kind of get that out of the way, let people get to know you a little bit. And we are going to actually talk about, I think, this sculpture right behind me. That's kind of why I started in this spot. And so I'll introduce this one and move around it a little bit, and we can talk a bit about your thoughts on it. This is by Friends with You, and the title is Never Ending Story, Spider-Man's Eye, and it's from 2019. And it's the material side of it, I think, is something we'll be talking about. This is listed as ripstop nylon and an electric fan, and the widest it gets is about 168 inches, so it's really large. And I'll move around a little bit so everyone can take a look at it.
Yeah, so one of the things I really love about Friends with You, when you think about inflatable sculptures, one of the things that people think of is childhood, because you remember a jumping castle or inflatable funny advertising animals, or maybe that wacky wavy man, and it brings a lot of joy. And Friends with You, their main kind of purpose with their art is to bring joy, kindness, and love. And I love, they say everything in the universe can and wants to be your friend, and so you should be friends with it. So I love this idea of using the inflatable in such a playful way, because it really fits so well with the material.
Yeah, and it has not one, but two smiley faces. So, I mean, it really does exude that sense of happiness and joy.
Yeah, and something that's interesting about Friends with You is the inflatable form makes a lot of sense with them, and some of their works are these giant inflatable, basically they are like jumping castles that kids can play on, but they also make work they do paintings, they do sculptures, they make plush toys, but everything they do is about joy and love. And so the inflatable form makes sense, but they use all different kinds of materials.
And I know I was looking up a little bit about Friends with You. Do you know much about, is it a large collective of artists? Is it just really one person, or is it a couple people?
So my understanding is that it's a collective of two artists, but that when they get these inflatables made, they have them fabricated. So they're not necessarily physically producing this giant inflatable, they're sending it to a company to produce it. So there's a lot of people involved in the production of it.
Yeah, and I think even with the exhibition, the image that we had may have actually been a rendering of the sculpture as opposed to the actual sculpture, as I fumble a little bit here with the camera. There we go. Yeah, go ahead.
And they have a lot of works that are similar to this, these kind of explosive, hanging, playful forms. But they've done a lot of floats almost. So it's like Macy's Day Parade style giant clouds that they're pulling and taking through the streets. So their way they use the inflatable is really great.
Yeah, and I mean the title too is something that I think, I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing, Never Ending Story, Spider-Man's Eye. I don't necessarily know what the title has to do with the work, but I know that Never Ending Story is a popular movie from my childhood in the 80s, yeah. and Spider-Man is still very much a popular, sort of pop icon today. But yeah, I wonder about your thoughts about kind of the way they title their work.
I love the title. When I heard the title for this piece, it just made me laugh and smile. And I feel like that makes total sense with their whole goal of making people happy and bringing joy. So I think they're just putting these wild, happy images together to make us smile.
Yeah. And it's like I mentioned, it's right in the front door. So it's the first thing you kind of see coming in. And I think that's really what we were thinking was this is one that hopefully will make people laugh or smile the moment they come in to the show. And I think, really sets the stage for the kind of interaction we want them to have. So we'll shift focus here. And this is very much a different form this another one hanging from the ceiling though. And this is Max Stryker Balancing Act from 1995. I think that makes it the oldest work in the show. And this is with Tyvek fabric. So it's kind of that real thick paper material.
Yeah, and I think that Max's work is really amazing, and it's kind of the most opposite thing in the show from Friends with You. He's really interested in the inflatable form because he thinks about it like a balloon, and how a balloon has this tension that it might pop or it might deflate. So you've got this balancing act between these two forms, and you really think about vulnerability and you think about struggle. And I think that that's also a really beautiful aspect of the inflatable, but it's exactly the opposite of what Friends with You are doing.
Yeah, and he has two works in the exhibition, and we'll see the other one later on, but both of them have this element of sharing the air, right? It's two, both of them are two figures, two human figures, and they are sharing the air that transfers back and forth. The other work, I think it's much more noticeable. This one is a little more subtle, but you do see how the one figure will go limp as the other one expands. And there's this kind of exchange between the two, although I don't think it's a closed system. There's air coming in from around it.
Yeah,
but when
another thing.
Well, I was just going to ask about, this one had a sort of a complicated install, right? And it's there's plugs and cables and motors and fans, and it's all kind of this elaborate system that is actually outside of what you might consider mostly the artwork itself. And so I was curious about your thoughts on whether to cover some of that or whether to show it, and because it seems like different artists have different approaches to that.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because the fans are so much a part of an inflatable artwork, but often they are hidden, so you don't really, it's kind of a little more magical when you don't see the fan. But I think in this work, he really wants you to think about that breath and that vulnerability. So exposing the fans allows us to see exactly what's going on with those figures.
Sure.
But another thing that I love about Max's work, he's been, like you said, these are from the 90s. And so before I ever made an inflatable work, I actually saw his work and was inspired by it. And he actually makes his own patterns and sews his work the same way I do. And I think he might be the only artist in the show that completely hand makes his own work.
Yeah, which is it is a different process, right? When the artist is involved in a step-by-step construction, I would imagine you have to kind of have almost maybe some costuming background. You have to have some kind of idea about how a human form wraps around in a three-dimensional way. I don't know what if your background included any of that kind of thing or not, but.
Yeah, I think the pattern making is definitely the most complex part of the process. And making it by hand, it's really this sort of way of taking a form and breaking it into these planes. And so for me, it took me quite a while to figure out the pattern making. And I had a little bit of experience with sewing, but not a ton. But for my own work, I found that it gave me so much power to be able to make these giant forms with so few materials. And I think Max probably had a similar experience where he realized the power that these could have and decided he should teach himself how to make them.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that maybe people who aren't familiar with this work and are visiting for the first time might be surprised to find out these are not, they're not latex balloons, right? These are, for the most part, they are a fabric or a fiber of some kind that is sewn together. And that's where the fans come into play too, because these are not airtight objects, right? They don't, we do have one airtight object in the exhibition, but overwhelmingly there is a fan to produce a force of air that helps keep these things inflated.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, like balancing, what kind of fan to use, how much pressure you need. Because if you go, for example, to a place that has a jumping castle, you'll see the fans are gigantic because people are literally bouncing on it, whereas these fans are much, much smaller for these smaller figures.
Yeah, the most of them seem to have the same fan setup, other than I think Max's are different, and they're probably 18-inch boxes, but the fans themselves are maybe 8 inches across, so they're not really large. But yeah, you have to adjust the speeds. We have little speedometer, kind of power knobs on them, so we can adjust them so they don't overinflate or underinflate. Well, let's slide over to last work that we wanted to chat about in this gallery, which is Seeker by Sharon Inglestein. And this is, I think, I don't want to say by far, I guess it seems by far to be the largest. I think it's larger in all dimensions, whereas some of the works are large in one dimension. This one is massive. It's, I think, 14 feet tall, so it doesn't actually even fit in our main gallery. So we have it out here in the sculpture court because thankfully we have tall enough ceilings for it.
That's amazing. I've never seen any of her work in person, but she's another one that I've known her work from before I made inflatables and looked at her work for inspiration.
And this one is made of nylon. So, talk about that as compared to Tyvek or what was the other one made of?
I think Ripstop was the first
Ripstop.
one.
Ripstop, yeah, Ripstop nylon. And this one's just listed as nylon fabric. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the materials, I feel like the Tyvek has a almost more papery kind of feel, whereas both the nylons are definitely fabrics. Ripstop is usually a little bit lighter than just the plain nylon. This looks, I can't tell for sure if this is like a taffeta, or I use a nylon, but my nylon is called Oxford, so it's like a thicker nylon. But one of the things I think that's really interesting about how she works is she's sort of at this in-between in her process, where she's actually programming into a computer to make all of her patterns. So she actually 3D models her stuff in Rhino, and then Rhino is a computer program that she can then choose the themes, and those themes then become patterns, and you can put them in a CNC cutter, and the cutter will actually cut out all the fabric for you. And then after that, someone will take it and sew it. So it's interesting because she does give it to a fabricator, but she makes all her 3D files herself.
Yeah, and I know she has, her work is often, at least in this current form, very much focused on the sphere, or a circle kind of form. And so that's what literally every one of these is a sphere shape. It's just that they happen to be cut off in different ways, so that some of them are, just half spheres, and some of them are more, some of them are less. But it's interesting to think about. It's just one form that makes up this whole larger form.
Yeah, and one thing I love about it is, even though it is just all those spheres, I feel like all of her forms feel really alive. They feel like these giant creatures to me, like a lot of different kinds of strange animals. So they just feel like they have such a big, kind of amazing presence.
Yeah, and I will say we put some sandbags in the leg, I call them legs, of this work. And so we actually had to look inside, and it was really kind of fascinating to see the internal structure as well, that helps to keep things in shape, which again is very much like kind of a fashion, I think of corsets and other sorts of dresses, and that have sort of things you don't see that are actually helping keep it together.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually, at one point I made an artwork that had vinyl windows in it, so you could see inside and see those structures and those themes. Because I also, when I first started making inflatables, was so interested in what it took on the inside that I wanted the viewers to actually see that.
Yeah, the hidden world. All right, we have two works in this next gallery. I'm going to move into those, which again, you're going to find different approaches, different themes, different materials. And first up, I wanted to show this one by Elizabeth Rossoff, 5 Xi'an American warriors. And so this is a reference to the terracotta warriors that maybe many of us are familiar with, but you kind of notice some differences to those original ones.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because she has been really interested in the Xi'an warriors for a while. So the original sculptures that she made were in terracotta, and they were smaller, more souvenir sized. And I watched a lecture that she gave where she talked about going to see the Xi'an warriors and how there's just miles and miles of gift shops as you walk up to them. And so she was really interested in this idea of commerce and how we commercialize different objects. And so she thought about putting these pop culture heads onto these warriors. And the original sculptures, as I said, they were all made out of terracotta and were much smaller.
Yeah, and these are, I have not personally seen the terracotta warriors, but I imagine these are probably closer in size to the real, terracotta warriors that are in China.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting too, because the Bedford Gallery commissioned her to make this piece specifically as an inflatable. So she actually had not made inflatable work before this. So they were transferring her original terracotta sculptures into this inflatable form. But I think what she's talking about works really well as an inflatable. You often think about when you go somewhere, they might have a giant inflatable to try to sell you something or to get you to go to their, car shop or such.
Yeah, and we have, so we have Shrek on the far left, we have Mickey Mouse, Bart Simpson, Spider-Man. That's the second Spider-Man reference in this one show. And then we, of course, have Batman on the other end. So I was commenting to our staff, at this point now, I think all but one of them is owned by Disney. So.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
So, but that's interesting too, that it was her first kind of foray into inflatable work, but inspired by some of her other sculptures. So she, I wonder if she's continued to work in this media, or if it's been kind of a one-off sort of exploration.
Yeah, and I don't know, because it was commissioned specifically for this show, which is fairly new. So she sounded like she was interested in the process and enjoyed it, but I don't know if she'll continue or not.
And I think the Bart Simpson one, it seemed like it had a slightly different title, so it was maybe earlier than the rest of them. So maybe that was like the first off, and then they built the rest of them after that. But yeah, it's really it's one of those really kind of striking works as you come into a gallery like this to see them all lined up like this. We'll turn the corner here. And I wanted to briefly mention, so for those that are Michigan, here we're in Michigan, this work, the skull, is by Joshua Harker, who is actually a Michigan-based artist. And he often works in 3D printing, but again, is an artist who was invited to do something inflatable, like Elizabeth. So it was also kind of a new exploration for him for the media. And we're hoping to maybe bring him for a talk, or have a talk with him over Zoom. We'll see how that goes, but keep an eye out for that. So speaking of generational things, this is something that maybe is a little different than your Spider-Man and your never-ending story, but Jacks aren't too aged. I remember playing with them when I was a child. So, but I don't know if they're a popular game anymore these days.
Yeah, I don't know. And I actually noticed, so I went on this artist, it's actually a collective, but there's one main artist that runs it. But I went on to their Instagram because I couldn't find a ton of information on their website. And he was talking about how jacks actually were played originally in like ancient Greece. So it's been a game for a really long time that we've played as humans, I guess.
Sure. And I mean, there's, different variations. I know we have a print in our Inuit art gallery of a bone game that we would play with pieces of bones. And they're, again, very similar to sort of a format of jacks. So it's definitely one of those games that crosses cultural boundaries, but maybe just doesn't have the same name, or it doesn't have the same shape to what it is they're playing with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another thing that's interesting, so this is a different process because this is a heat welded process, I understand. And so this one actually doesn't have a fan. And there's other versions that this artist has made of these jacks that are fairly large, and he's taken them to Burning Man, and there's photos with people climbing all over them. So it's really interesting to see the inflatable as this kind of closed system that you could actually interact with in that way.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know much about the material that's used. It's a fascinating, sort of luminescence to it that I really enjoy. We don't have color lights on these, but it is because of the physics of light, it is separating them into different colors and creating sort of rainbow effects and prism effects throughout.
Yeah, and I know it's a dichroic vinyl, but I actually have looked because I'm curious about how to use this material myself because it's such a beautiful material. So I do know it's a dichroic vinyl, but that's about all I know.
Sure. All right, for sake of time, we'll move to the one last one I wanted to make sure we have a chance to look at is Max's other one. And then we'll have you talk a little bit about your own work. And of course, we'll see the giant flamingos as we go in. It's kind of hard to miss them.
Oh yeah, I can't miss those.
Two large flamingos that take up most of the gallery. Really another statement piece here. So this is Max Striker's other work that is in the show. This is called Romulus and Remus. And as I mentioned earlier, two figures that are sharing air, but this one's a little more dramatic as one deflates completely and the other inflates.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I personally love seeing his work because all of those themes to me, knowing that he's creating his own patterns and hand sewing them, I find the way he does it seems really beautiful because I personally, human forms, I think are very complicated and I've never tried to make a human form an inflatable. And I'm just really impressed by the like delicate nature of his sculpture.
Yeah, and this one is listed as a nylon spinnaker fabric, which I was thinking it was another sort of papery kind of Tyvek material because it certainly crinkles. I'm not sure if my microphone picks it up, but it definitely has that paper feel to it.
Yeah, and I just love it's the kind of delicate balance of them collapsing. It makes me think so much of breath and of vulnerability that he talks about liking to capture in his work.
I'm just trying to zoom in here with my handheld to show the patterning, right? The piecing together of all these strips and shapes.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting looking at it close. When I notice this with my own work, the seams with time, they actually get darker because as the air blows through them, the dirt doesn't stick to the fabric, but it sticks to the thread. So the thread almost turns a darker color, which is, I think I've noticed it in my own work. And I can see it as we get closer to the work, that the thread actually looks darker.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this one is a little newer. I think it's listed as 2006, so it's newer than the one out in the court, but it's got some years on it. And it's held up pretty well, it appears.
Yeah, it's amazing how durable inflatables are as well. That's another thing as a sculptor. If you work in ceramics, it's like everything's very delicate, but with an inflatable, you can just shove it into a box and send it across the country. I often put mine in suitcases to take them places. So they're just really versatile for being able to move them around and store them.